the wake of Chernobyl, thousands of people had their lives destroyed and their communities obliterated. We got told in response that things would get better. We'd have more regulation. Just this year, we experienced Fukushima, and thousands of people had the same fate dealt to them in Japan. What we say on side proposition is that enough's enough. We need to change things and we need to abandon nuclear energy. And today we stand before you proposing this motion in the name of the tens of thousands of citizens who had their lives destroyed in those disasters. But moreover, we stand before you in the name of the thousands or the millions and millions of citizens around the world who live in countries where they're exposed to this risk every single day, ladies and gentlemen. So what are we proposing on side proposition? Well, quite simply, we're talking about phasing out all nuclear power stations over what we would say is a reasonable period of time, which allows the decommissioning of these power stations in a safe and methodical way, and also which allows countries to get in place the alternative forms of energy, which we think are in place in many countries at the moment and won't take long. We note that in Germany, they have said that this will only take them 3 years now. But some countries that might take longer, but we'd allow them to take their time in order to get those precautions in place. We're going to tell you why this policy will be so positive for those citizens I talked about in 4 key points. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you. No, thanks. You're in side voice, mate. I can't hear you. So, I'm going to talk to you firstly about the monumental risks of nuclear energy to humanity, which mean that we should never have nuclear energy as an option. Second, I'm going to talk to you about even when there are meltdowns, the financial and environmental costs and how massive those are of nuclear energy. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about how we have so many viable energy sources which are far better than nuclear energy. Thomas is going to talk to you about the risk of allowing nuclear energy and the effects that has on rogue states and international security. So on to my first point. What we tell you is that as much as governments want to deny it, there is always a significant chance of nuclear disaster and meltdown. We see this most recently with the Fukushima disaster, and the reason for that was that there was a natural disaster, and when those natural disasters occur and they destroy or they damage nuclear power stations, that has massive effects, which mean that there's a high risk of meltdown. We see this in even other areas of the world. In California, no thanks. In California, so many nuclear power stations are built on fault lines, and there's a risk of earthquake in those places. And so those people in those communities are risked as well. Moreover, we say faults in technology can lead to these meltdowns, because we think private companies always have the incentive to cut costs, as do governments. We saw this with TEPCO in Japan, who, because of the monumental cost of regulating, which I'm going to talk about more on my second point, they had an incentive to cut corners as much as possible, because they aren't directly accountable to the citizens that they are hurting. We saw this in Chernobyl, where there was both technical failure and there wasn't a containment field that contains the effects of the meltdown and the aftermath. And that was because within states, people will continually cut corners. And we don't think this debate takes place in a perfect world. We're all countries are going to have the perfect type of regulation that I'm sure they're going to come out and tell you that they want them to. We also point to the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN body for nuclear energy, told Japan that they should tsunami-proof the Fukushima energy plant before the tsunami and the meltdown occurred. That's clear. That shows you clearly that people don't respond to the safety regulations that are advised to them. We say when the meltdown or disaster does inevitably occur, that has massive effects on humanity. We say, firstly, quite simply, people die from radiation, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we say generations of people are exposed to risk of cancer, which are passed down. And finally, we say entire communities are declared uninhabitable as a result of the effects of these nuclear disasters. And we think governments, in the name of that, should err on the side of caution, because the point to note here is that these are innocent people. These are people who are going about their daily lives and shouldn't be exposed to this type of effect. Moving on to my second point, about how even when there aren't meltdowns, there are massive financial and environmental costs. And before I talk about those, I'll take a point.
If you can force all countries to give up nuclear technology, why can't we force them to comply with IAEA regulations?
We're not talking about, going in and forcibly removing the governments who don't do this. We're saying, in principle, all governments should remove these, the nuclear energy because of the disastrous effects on their own citizens that I've talked about. So back onto my second substantive about the financial and environmental costs of nuclear energy. Firstly, in terms of financial costs, we think there's massive building costs, because, and those have to constantly be renewed, because no technology is still up to date in 100 years' time. And so we think that means that there are massive costs of having nuclear energy on the citizens there. But moreover, we say the costs of safety and regulation are massive, because of things like having containment fields. That means you have to have massive bodies of water and lead surrounding the nuclear energy agencies. That means the costs to states are massive of doing that. And that, as I said before, gives an incentive to cut corners for governments and private companies, whoever's running these. But moreover, we'd say it also appears that the nuclear energy is much cheaper than it actually is, because of the fact that no one wants to insure it, because of the risks I just talked about. So that means governments are able to quote figures which are far below the actual cost of having that nuclear energy in place. Final reason it has such high financial costs is because the marginal cost of sourcing uranium and plutonium is constantly rising, because you're constantly having to be digging deeper and deeper into the ground in order to get new sources of plutonium and uranium. And that's also an environmental cost. But what are the other environmental costs? We'd say firstly it's not clear that that nuclear energy is all that sustainable in itself. Many academics say it will only last us for 100 years. Conservative estimates put it at just 200 years. But moreover, we'd say the dumping of the nuclear waste after it's been used completely destroys environments, because we think it's the developed countries generally dump their nuclear waste in developing countries or in seas. And so when we saw France and Italy dump their nuclear waste off the coast of Somalia, that completely destroyed the revenue streams for people in Somalia, if you excuse the pun. And what we say is that means that meant that people weren't able to fish in the seas of Somalia, and that meant that they had to turn to piracy, and that destroyed those communities. We also think, it destroys entire ecosystems. Finally, we say there are many viable energy sources which we would be better to pursue, because we say as our technology increases, so does our ability to use other renewable resources. We give you the examples of wind, of solar power. Entire houses are becoming self-sustainable because of solar panels on their roofs. Hydropower, hydroelectricity. We say, it's entirely achievable. Look, if Dundee can have wind turbines, we think anyone can. but we say, moreover, these are sources which we have to remember are renewable, and it's not clear that nuclear technology is. But we also say, when faults in technology or natural disasters do occur, these are the types of energy sources which don't have the disastrous and long-term effects I talked about how nuclear energy does. And we say, and Team Singapore will probably come out and tell you that technology is a far way off. We say that's not true, firstly because governments can't spend money on both, but secondly it's less profitable for private companies to go into because of the fact that the energy industry is now dominated by government-backed nuclear agencies. So we're coming up here, Team New Zealand comes up here in the name of the people who are at risk to the exposure of the harmful effects of nuclear energy, and it's in their name that we are honoured to propose.
You want to sit over here?
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
It's okay.
Thanks. Thank you. Sorry.
And I should open the case to the opposition of convention.
Thank you.
We too care about people. And the base principle we stand for today is that not abandoning nuclear energy saves lives and saves the world. Don't get us wrong. What's the principle we stand for today? We don't have, on side opposition, to stand for all types of nuclear energy. We can stand for it with a set of regulations and We think what's going to happen under our model is all nuclear reactors must be inspected regularly by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Countries which want to have nuclear energy must be signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all nuclear reactors must conform to basic safety rules which are the status quo today, which include, but are not limited to, things like a tiered safety system, where humans will monitor computers, which in turn check on other humans to ensure that things like reactor core conditions, reactor temperatures, remain safe. Nuclear reactors, in our model, are going to be sited away from the disaster-prone zones like Fukushima, which they raise, with sufficient buffer zones, no thank you, surrounding them. Any reactors that don't meet the conditions we suggested are going to be shut down immediately. We've seen a track record of success in France and Germany. No thank you. We stand for nuclear energy as part of a toolbox of energy options for different countries. But our position here is that nuclear energy has unique advantages today which are too valuable to give up. No thank you. We're going to stand today on three constructive arguments. No thank you. First, that nuclear energy is safe. Second, that it saves the environment today. And lastly, my second speaker will argue that it encourages energy independence. But before I move to my positive matter, no thank you, let's look at two questions. First, does their model work? Second, will their model really achieve, will their model have good practical effects? So let's first talk about the model. No thank you. Let's talk about the alternatives they tried to raise as part of their third substantive point, which wasn't a point given that they would spend less than 30 seconds on it. All they gave us was a list of alternatives and a small snide joke about Dundee. Well, it's fortunate that Dundee has wind power and is able to tap on it. But think about lots of other countries like Singapore, countries in Southeast Asia where the wind conditions aren't the same. We say that lots of countries can't have access to the alternative energy technologies they talk about. And furthermore, in my substantive argument, I'm going to demonstrate why lots of these alternative energy technologies are ineffective and in fact harm the environment. Listen to that first, sir. Well, we're going to look at their next argument. That, well, the International Atomic Energy Agency tried to persuade Japan to make their reactors tsunami-proof, but it didn't happen. Well, they said what's going to happen is they still want, no thank you, to get everyone to eliminate their nuclear reactors. They say it's a commitment, I quote, in principle. Well, a commitment in principle is pretty hollow if you don't get anything achieved in the real world. On our side, we think we too, if they want to take that line and stand in principle, that governments should have to follow the International Atomic Energy Agency. No thank you. So let's look now at the practical effects. And here, they gave this argument as their first issue about how nuclear energy isn't an option because people are hurt in daily life. That's simply not true. They've conceded that buffer zones can be built around nuclear plants, and buffer zones are to prevent people from getting hurt. So we don't understand why it still happens. Then they said there are huge facilities, no thank you sir, and containment fields. Well, we say these are going to be easy and cheap to procure because we don't have to build such nuclear plants in urban centers where land is really expensive. Then they make two final straight points about dumping waste in the third world in countries like Somalia and ecosystems being hurt. Well, we simply don't have to support those kinds of things. Tell us why it's otherwise.
When Iran and Japan don't comply with the regulations that you say must be enforced, how are you going to?
Sir, it's a question on both sides of not being able to be perfectly enforceable. The question is, which side is better able to save the environment today? That's what I'm going to show in my substantive argument. Hold on a moment. No thank you. And now I'm going to move to my substantive matter, where I talk about why nuclear energy is really a safe option. Our thesis is that we shouldn't abandon nuclear energy because our model has a track record of safety for far outstripping those of traditional fuel sources. Now, nuclear energy is a lot more efficient than fossil fuels. You only need a few reactors to power huge regions and countries because it relies on fundamental forces in atoms rather than a very inefficient combustion of fossil fuels. We've already talked about regulations that are going to work, and plants are going to shut down, no thank you, the moment anything is suspected to be amiss. That's why we think, even if they raise some accidents at Chernobyl and at Fukushima, let's realize the reality about them. I'm going to take them down now. What happened in Fukushima? We only saw the reactor having a meltdown because the plant had already been structurally unsound for 2 years. It needed a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and a huge tsunami to take it down. No thank you, sir. Then they talked about Chernobyl. Point is, it's not relevant under our model because it was outdated technology. The Soviets at the time decided to conceal the fact that radiation was being exposed to the people. No thank you. So we don't see why there was even a relevant case study. Both examples taken up. Furthermore, in comparison with other energy sources, nuclear energy has a far better safety record. Compare this with oil, where we saw the Deepwater Horizon explosion last year, which destroyed entire parts of the coastline in the Gulf of Mexico area, and also leads to resource conflicts between power-hungry factions, a point my second speaker will further elaborate upon. And look at coal. Look at the number of miners who die every year in China. Every year, it's double the number of total casualties from nuclear accidents alone. And even in New Zealand, where there are great safety rules for coal miners, they couldn't stop the Christchurch coal mine disaster that occurred last year. This is systemic, ladies and gentlemen, to existing fossil fuel sources, not nuclear energy, especially because we've exhausted easy sources of fossil fuels. Now we're going to have to go into shale deposits, where it's really hard to pick up some of these things. So there's a lack of profits. There isn't a need for them to meet safety regulations. We don't think it's working when it comes to safety. Yes?
Given you only want nuclear power stations in what you call safe areas that aren't being used, would you recommend 90% of nuclear power stations in the world?
So we don't see why we need to do that. All we're suggesting is nuclear power that's effective. You're trying to ask us to defend nuclear power that's not effective. That's not our burden. Moving back to my case about why we save the environment today. Because we shouldn't abandon nuclear energy, my thesis, because it's far cleaner than existing alternatives. They talk about alternatives, but let's look at 3 reasons why they're ineffective. First, they're unproven and inconsistent. For solar power, which they say can power individual houses, to power the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, you're going to have to cover the whole of Texas with solar panels. For wind power, the EU has been trying to subsidize wind power to meet its greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2020. The point is, wind patterns keep changing. They haven't met anything beyond the minimal targets that they've set. Let's talk about the Three Gorges Dam as well, where huge silt deposits that they didn't realize at the bottom have made it increasingly inefficient every year. That's the first reason covered. Let's look at the second reason. Many countries lack access to such alternatives. If there are no strong tides, no high winds, and a lack of land space, it's quite clear loads of alternative energy sources are out for you. That sounds like Singapore. We're quite sad about that. In the third place, we think lots of alternative energy sources aren't green. Wind energy, for example, disrupts migratory patterns of loads of birds around the world. The Mekong Dam in the Southeast Asian region, for example, messed up the river flows within the entire Southeast Asian region and resulted in a reduction in fish stocks by in excess of 80%. It's urgent that we deal with environmental problems because of the urgency of climate change today, and we think in comparison, nuclear energy is a lot more effective because it already meets 95% of France's electricity needs, for example. Every country can build nuclear plants, and even if there's waste, we are already storing in safe places in New Mexico. We don't see why nuclear energy should be abandoned. We've shown why it's safe and why it meets their yardsticks today.
It seems fairly odd that they've been prepared to tell us that nuclear power is a solution for all countries, and yet at the same time, they're prepared to impose harsh regulations that most countries won't be able to meet. We don't think they solve that problem. We don't think any of the benefits that they want to talk about actually accrue. Today, I'm going to look at 2 substantive points. Firstly, how this increases the impetus for developing alternative energy sources, and secondly, how it reduces the chance of rogue states being able to develop nuclear weapons. But firstly, I'm going to look at 2 areas of rebuttal. So the first thing I'm going to look at is this idea of does regulation work? So we think that for regulation to work, you need countries to be able to constantly update their technologies, and we think that something that doesn't realistically happen in the world of nuclear energy, because there's always an incentive to cost cut. There's always this incentive that acts on governments or private firms to get the lowest cost possible, cut corners, or meet the very minimum safety obligations. They have to show us why that incentive doesn't apply. Also, they've told us, we think that most of the countries that actually lack the ability to use other sources of energy are actually poor, and are actually those countries that are going to least be able to develop nuclear energy. They've also wanted to talk to us about buffer zones and how great they are. And at the same time, they wanted to talk about how good nuclear power is for a country like Singapore. We don't think you can have a massive buffer zone when an island is 20 kilometres across. So then they told us that, we can protect for things like earthquakes. Well, we think, no, we can't. We think the perfect example is an earthquake which actually did occur in Christchurch. And we think that this is shown by the fact that there was no known fault line in Christchurch, and yet a massive 7 magnitude earthquake occurred. The point of natural disasters is they're unpredictable. We don't know when they're going to happen. We don't think that countries are able to predict when these disasters are going to happen and plan accordingly. No, thank you. So then they came up to us and told us about they essentially rubbished every other source of energy other than nuclear power. We think this was utterly ludicrous. So they told us with solar power it's really inefficient and you'd need to have solar panels all over Texas to power the eastern seaboard. We don't think this is true. We think that California has made massive inroads in building solar panels, and actually, because they have a desert, have been able to build a massive plant that generates gigawatts of energy, providing most of California's energy source today. We also think they've entirely ignored other sources like geothermal, like tidal power. So then they told us that, lots of people die in coal mining in China. Firstly, we don't stand for people dying in coal mines in China, and we think there's things they can do to improve. Secondly, we think that the thing with coal mining is it hurts miners who are actually paid to do so. The point of nuclear energy is it hurts innocent people who just happen to live in the vicinity where there's a meltdown. We think that's an unacceptable risk. It isn't something that we're prepared to stand for on this side of the house. No, thank you. We also see that when you have minor deaths due to things like coal power, it doesn't kill and destroy entire communities for decades. We see this in the fact that Chernobyl is now virtually uninhabited. We see this in the fact that wildlife has been eliminated in the area. We see this in the fact that hundreds of thousands are now suffering from cancers as a result of this dangerous legacy. So because they can't prove that their supposed regulation is actually going to solve this problem, they can't point to all these benefits, and they can't just rubbish every other source of energy, which most countries are using effectively at the moment. So now I move to my first substantive point, how this reduces the impetus for the development of alternative energies. So we think that we actually do need a lot of investment in alternative energy sources if we are going to solve these long-term problems they want us to talk about, like climate change. However, we think the problem with this is when you have nuclear energy, you reduce all the incentives acting on both the government and the private sector to be able to develop this sort of technology we so desperately need. So we think that nuclear power does have risks, and we think those are unacceptable risks for us to be taking in the long term. We think we're better to look for other sources and then develop the technology we need for the future. Now, they've wanted to rubbish things like solar power and how inefficient it is, but we think the nature of things like solar power is the technology is constantly increasing. At the start of this decade, the efficiency of photovoltaic cells was about 2%. Today it's 8%, and there's technologies and labs that give us 20% efficiency. We think that as we move into the future, even in the next couple of years, these technologies become more and more viable and more useful to us as a replacement for this inefficient and dangerous source of energy, which we think is unsustainable. Yes.
Unpredictable natural disasters can cause oil rig disasters and coal mine collapses that hurt innocents as well. Would you shut down these forms of energy as well?
No, but we think that when you stop the need for oil, when you invest in sources for the long term. Also, we think that when an oil rig blows up because of a natural disaster, it doesn't result in hundreds of thousands of people getting cancer and the effects being felt for decades. That's not something that we're prepared to stand for. So back to this point about how it reduces the impetus for the development of the sort of clean energy sources that we want to see. We've seen this in Germany. When they announced that they'd be phasing out their nuclear energy, they actually announced a widespread program of solar power. We think that it incentivizes the development of these sort of technologies and means that we actually get the long-lasting solutions that don't put human life at risk from massive catastrophes. We think that we need long-term solutions to our energy problems. So now I turn to my second substantive point, how this allows rogue states to gain nuclear weapons. So we think that fundamentally, the technologies used to develop nuclear weapons and for peaceful nuclear energy are actually quite similar. We saw this in the fact that the Manhattan Project was designed to create bombs to kill the Japanese, and it led to the development of the nuclear technology we see today. So we think that when there's this proliferation of technology readily available and huge supply chains of uranium, huge expertise out there, it actually makes it incredibly easy for rogue states, places like Iran, to gain these sources and then develop nuclear bombs, which is something that we obviously think is bad. So we've seen this in Iran, where we think that they're using the guise of developing nuclear energy in order to develop a nuclear weapons program. And we think that the West is actually unable to stop this, because the West, if it's using nuclear energy itself, it needs to stand up for the rights of all states to be able to use this. It can't be seen to be hypocritical. It can't be seen to impede these programs, which in the end create dangerous results and power imbalances in global security. Also, we've seen that other nations like India have used nuclear energy as a stepping stone to gain nuclear weapons. We think that nations like this, when they have nuclear weapons, end up disrupting the power balance. We think that under their system, you're unable to stop these rogue nations from developing nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons under the guise of peaceful nuclear technology. So because all their ideas about regulation don't reflect the real-life incentives that act on every firm and every government, because they fail to recognise that other sources are good, are working, and are only getting better, we were proud to propose.
Thank you, Secretary of Mr. Speaker, for your speech. And let's continue please with the opposition. I call upon Ashish Kumar.
One of the things we debaters are always told not to do is to make hasty decisions. Because sometimes I say things on the floor which sound smart, but later I realize I'm actually pretty damn stupid. We think, in terms of New Zealand's policy, they're also making the exact kind of hasty decision. I have 3 points of contention. Firstly, whose policy works? I'm going to take down that point of substantive about rogue states in that one. Secondly, I'm going to weigh up the harms of nuclear energy and alternative energies and show you why nuclear energy does have the unique benefits we talked about. And last of all, are we going to take away the impetus to develop other sources of energy? Firstly, whose policy works? New Zealand said we only want to debate this in principle. But we said, look, this is a debate which takes place in the real world where real action must happen. It's not fair for them to levy a demand on us that we show why we can enforce our policy everywhere in the world when their policy is a much more extensive policy change than ours. The policy changes on their side are massive relative to ours. And we tell you they have to prove that the policy even happens before they try to talk about rogue states and how we can enforce these. Anyway, they then talk about how companies are always going to cut corners in our case. That's just not true, no thank you. Because the backlash you get if anyone in society finds out you have been doing this is massive. We look at what happened in Japan, where the company is basically about to go bust because of that one incident. Companies have a very strong incentive not to cut corners. And they say companies never upgrade. That's not true. The company in France who designed these nuclear models constantly updates its models to fit and improve and enhance IAEA regulation. So that is factually untrue. Then they say, in many cases, we just do not know where the fault lines are, no thank you, and natural disasters are just unpredictable. Yes, they are always going to be unpredictable, but we can vastly minimize the chances of these from happening by not building a nuclear plant on the spot where we know an earthquake is very likely to happen. We can vastly minimize them. And even if some are quite unpredictable, we tell you can vastly minimize the chances of these harms by making them really, really safe, by having powerful buffer zones. Benjamin talked about how the Fukushima example stands for outside of the house, because a nuclear reactor, which 2 years ago had been deemed structurally unsound, which wouldn't even exist in our policy, which is built on top of a fault line, what did it need to take this pretty lousy nuclear reactor down? The second largest earthquake ever in human history, no thank you, and one of the largest tsunamis ever in human history. Now, given that the worst possible scenario is that, and we're not even going to let that happen, we tell you our policy is a pretty good one. No thank you. Then we talk then about rogue states. We tell you, firstly, we are going to make all states sign up to the NPPT. So, in principle, if that's what you want to talk about, these rogue states are not going to be going under our policy. No thank you. Secondly, we tell you, the sort of materials they need to develop nuclear weapons is incredibly different from the technology you need to develop civilian nuclear energy. You need very advanced centrifuges, which you need to buy from the market at extremely high prices. We know when they're doing this, and we can sanction it and stop it. Thirdly, no thank you, we can just simply sabotage our equipment, like the US did when it sent Stuxnet into all of Iran's centrifuges and stopped them working for quite a long period of time. So no, we can't stop rogue states. Anyway, let's move on, no thank you, then to weigh up the harms of both kinds of energy. They dropped a lot of this when Ben came up and rebutted it and told you why there's a massive trend of success. But let's develop these arguments anyway. They said that we need to build very large containment fields, which are made of large bodies of water. That's precisely the point. The most powerful deterrent to nuclear radiation is water. That's a very cheap and efficient way of preventing nuclear reactions from becoming runaway. That's why many nuclear reactors might have small incidents, but none of these ever became significant. What happened at the 3 Mile incident, which is considered one of the 3 largest nuclear accidents in the whole of history? No thank you. The reaction was contained within the vessel, not a single person was harmed. That's how our mechanisms are going to work. Then we talked about how radiation lasts for generations. The problem is, no thank you, the elements which last for very long and take a long time to decay, like thorium and cesium, yes, I'm a bit of a geek, tend to be those which release the lowest levels of radiation. And the media tends to drastically exaggerate, no thank you, the harms of these. For instance, in the so-called contaminated zone in Japan today, most experts concur that the amount of radiation increase is equivalent to every household getting an extra microwave. That's how small the actual harms are, and that's how high the harms have been in the media, don't buy those sorts of things. In contrast, we tell you other forms of energy have massive harms. I'll take a moment, sir, and he never really came back to rebut this. But before I move on, yes.
If it was true that it was so cheap and so easy to have all these preventative measures in place, then why didn't Japan have just done it before one of the disasters that they just saw?
Because there are many paranoid people in society who still have images of Chernobyl and the Cold War in their mind, who think that this is wrong. We think those images are false. We need to change these perceptions and do what's good for the people. Moving back to my point. These other forms of energy are extremely harmful and we never dealt with them. We told you about hydroelectricity massively harms river ecosystems, causes humanitarian disasters. We pointed to the fact that even things like geothermal energy, which they just raised, often harm the water table and poison water sources for large numbers of people. So those don't work as well. Let me now move on, therefore, to my point of substantive no thank you, but why our policy encourages energy independence among nations and why this is an extremely useful thing to do. And along the way, I'll be showing you why the kind of harms we talked about no thank you, about us being unable to develop other sources of green energy are also completely false. In the status quo, as Ben has mentioned already, no thank you, current sources of energy are concentrated in certain countries and in certain regions around the world. This is extremely problematic for certain reasons. Firstly, I'll take in a moment. The fact that our sources are so limited means that small fluctuations can damage the entire world economy. We point to the fact that the way the OECD changes oil prices often causes shocks to the entire economy. Yes.
Given that the nations that tend to have all these other resources and the ability to generate other energy tend to be rich ones, how do you cope with the energy situation in poorer nations?
Okay, I guess this is where you try to resurrect the point about it being hypocritical that some nations can develop it and some nations can't. We tell you, nations should try to develop energy in a way which best suits their unique advantages. We tell you, it is not wrong for the US to develop this energy just because the poorer nations can't develop it. In any case, we tell you, the US having more efficient forms of energy might very well free up resources it could use to aid poorer nations in developing these sorts of energies. So we tell you, that's not a problem anyway. The second problem under their status quo is that nations use their control of these energy resources to threaten other countries. When the Yom Kippur War happened, no thank you, Saudi Arabia massively increased oil prices and caused 2 successive massive massive problems within the world economy, the 1973 and the 1979 oil shocks. We pointed to the manner in which Russia uses the control of oil in Europe to threaten countries like Ukraine to change their foreign policy. Thirdly, we say that many of the countries from which we buy these sorts of energy sources are pretty nasty countries in the first place. Many countries which supply these sources are dictatorships in Africa or questionable democracies like Russia. Our policy solves this because, as Ben has mentioned, nuclear fuel is extremely easy to get because very little of it is needed to create the sort of reactor you need to generate vast amounts of energy, 3 kg for every single year. Secondly, we now know that nuclear waste and nuclear resources, can be harvested from seawater, and that means that many countries around the world now have this option open to them. Thirdly, the vast majority of the world's suppliers of uranium and thorium and other nuclear fuels are pretty nice countries like Canada and Australia. And we much rather buy from these countries than for corrupt countries who are going to use this to threaten other nations. What am I showing you therefore? The alternatives they want to talk about are extremely inefficient. But in the interim, we need to find a way to solve these harms, and it's better for us to put our resources to nuclear energy. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand and be opposed.
Thank the second opposition speaker for his speech, and to continue the case for the proposition, I call on Nick Moore.
Mr. Speaker, I can almost smell the uranium on Singapore's brick wall. But more than that, it's a rather tainted odour, because they don't have to support nuclear energy in cities. So there goes all of California's nuclear power plants. They're going to have massive walls around all these new nuclear plants. So there goes the ability of all the poorer countries to build them. And they're not going to build them in risky areas where there could be earthquakes. So there goes the entire Pacific Rim, like the Indian Ocean and like half the Atlantic. The approach of Singapore in this debate has been to retreat from the real issues continually, whereas New Zealand has stood up for those communities that have been devastated by nuclear disasters and environmental devastation. And we were willing to sacrifice some short-rod economic benefits, but we think we gave you a better solution to energy issues in the long term. Before I move on to the 3 issues in this debate, firstly, why nuclear energy poses such a threat to humanity that it would be grossly irresponsible to keep it going. Secondly, that the environmental impact is so much worse under their system. And thirdly, why removing nuclear energy in fact provides the soundest solution to energy issues. Let's just respond to 2 quick challenges. Firstly, they challenged us to live in the real world. So we have to prove all countries will actually agree to this. This is a policy debate, which means that we have to prove what's good for governments to do. So we don't have to prove that they will necessarily do it, because I can't control what North Korea does with its energy. But to that extent, we prove that it's a good thing for countries to do it. Secondly, this mischaracterization is a hasty decision. We think that that's something that they really need to consider, that perhaps their side of the House is doing. We're thinking about the long term in this debate. So firstly, why does nuclear energy pose such a threat to humanity that it would be grossly irresponsible to keep it going? So we tell you about kids in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who continue to be born missing a leg or an arm, or the communities surrounding the Chernobyl power plant within a 50-kilometre radius, which are so sick and poor and lifeless and have been obliterated by the effects of that disaster. What we had from the opposition was this naive approach that said the risks aren't that great. So firstly, their response to this was essentially throughout the whole debate that they're going to enforce it through the IAEA and so on. Firstly, that doesn't check every single plant in the world, especially often in developing countries, and it certainly doesn't check them every year. So it's not a foolproof system. But even if it does check them, if those countries aren't complying, there's not an awful lot that they can do in many situations. So it tells the world, or publishes a report that says they're not complying. It doesn't actually start them complying. told you about natural disasters, like how, for example, California's power plants are built on one giant fault line on the Pacific Rim. How like an 8.0 earthquake in northern France would devastate hundreds of towns. What they then tried to do was make this analogy with oil disasters. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's be quite clear about this. Like the BP disaster, it was terrible. It was like the worst oil disaster we've had in years. And there's nothing in comparison with destroying so many thousands of lives, like we have with instances like Chernobyl, like potential effects if we had a nuclear meltdown in France. Thirdly, we say though, that attacks by terrorists or rogue states also provide like an incredible threat to those sorts of nuclear plant safety. So nuclear plants are often perfect targets if you want to devastate an entire community. It's very easy for them to do so. They haven't responded to that either. Then Thomas told you how they can also fall into the hands of like rogue states like Syria or Iran or so on. What we heard in response from the second speaker was, well, advanced centrifuges are very expensive and you'll be able to identify if they're doing that. But firstly, we say to that, like the most important ingredient is clearly like the nuclear energy, the uranium and so on. But secondly and more importantly, it only takes one corrupt official to provide that energy and that information to the people in those states. It's very easier for Syria and Iran to get their hands on that stuff without people being aware of it. Secondly, they said, well, you can sabotage those rogue states like we did in Iran. We think that's too massive an infringement on sovereignty. It's better to try it in the first place rather than just like provoking those nations enormously. So moving on to the second issue then, I'll take this POI now.
So you're okay with an infringement of sovereignty where you force every single country to go away from nuclear energy, but you're not okay with sabotaging nuclear energy?
Well, it's not so much that. It's just that we don't think that like the US should be like going into these states and trying to like sabotage their plants. We think that in the first place we should try and prevent those situations occurring. Secondly, environmental impact. So what we told you about was like the dumping of nuclear waste, which is like devastating the oceans around Somalia and fishing for those communities. About the overheating of waterways required to cool nuclear plants and the excavation of vast tracts of land in Australia and so on. What they heard from the negating team as well, we don't have to support these sorts of uses. But like they said, so like we don't have to support this like sort of development in like Somalia and so on. The problem is that like the waste is actually dumped in those countries, right? So it's not that like you don't support the plants actually being built in Somalia. It's just that that's like the inevitable process that occurs when nuclear plants are there. Then they said, well, in comparison with other alternative forms, like these other ones like curved water table and so on, geothermal, like according to their analysis, we don't have to support that either. But the problem, but even if that was like, but we think that you need to actually live in the real world in this debate, and we think that those sorts of costs to the environment are nowhere near the size of the costs of like the devastation of these vast tracts of land in Australia and this dumping of waste. Finally, they said, well, you can like use oil, you can use like oil to like control and threaten other nations. So like firstly, like oil is running out, so like that's not going to be the case for like in the years in the future. But what they do under their model is continue that monopoly because they provide nuclear power to all those states that can exert much more control through it, and therefore they actually like perpetuate the problem that they're trying to solve in the second substantive point. So thirdly, why removing nuclear energy provides a sounder solution to energy issues. So, like, if this was sort of the crux of the engagement case, then they need to prove that it will be like considerably more sustainable in the long term. Otherwise, none of the rhetoric about energy stands. So, firstly, we tell you that it's not a sustainable solution. So, we told you that there's like limited quantities of uranium and plutonium, and according to many estimates, they're only going to last like the next 200 or so years. Therefore, we need alternative forms of energy, and we need to recognise that immediately. And we have viable forms that we told you about at first and second speaker. Their responses to this were twofold. Firstly, they said that some countries, like Singapore, lack the natural resources to do that. The problem with this analysis is that we think that the vast majority, if not every country in the world, possesses some resources that make it useful for certain natural resources. So maybe, like Singapore doesn't have as much wind, but it has a hell of a lot of sunlight that it can use for solar energy. Scotland may not have so much sun, but unfortunately that's a lot of wind, so that's useful for Scotland. Then they said, oh, it's been unproven to work in the past. We gave you examples of the way it is working. So we told you about solar energy success in Germany, about the fact that hydropower provides most of New Zealand's electricity. But secondly, we think the reason that they may not be working as much as they could right now is because of a lack of investment in them right now. So we think it's highly likely that they will improve in the future under our model because you actually create an incentive to invest in and improve on other forms of energy. So what you do by focusing on nuclear right now is you make it much less profitable for private companies to invest in nuclear energy because it's no longer viable in comparisons like, to invest in like renewable forms of energy because is no longer profitable in comparison to nuclear. We also said that it reduces pressure on governments to invest in other renewable forms, which are much more sustainable in the long term. Because again, we have a short-term solution of nuclear, which is just going to lead us into the same sort of crisis as happened before. So because we provided you with the most sustainable energy solution in the long term, but more than that, we were proud to stand up for those people who have been devastated by nuclear energy disasters in the past and will continue to be devastated in the future. We're proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. Proposition Speaker, for his speech. And then to continue the case for the opposition, I call Matteo Energia.
3 points of contention today. First, that nuclear energy is safe. Second, that alternative energy is not ready. Finally, that nuclear energy is good for the world. And as a team, we will show you that nuclear energy does possess special advantages, which means it should not be removed. Let's go on to my first point of contention, that nuclear energy is safe. From the beginning of this debate, we've given you a clear-cut model of enforcement by the IAEA. We've given you clear examples of where nuclear energy has always been safe in France and Germany, and we don't think we've heard enough of a systemic response from their side of the house. They gave us this strange rebuttal about cost cutting, right? They said every government and every company wants to cut costs, so your facilities are going to be horribly, horribly unsafe. But my second speaker came up and told you that no, companies and governments won't do this because the negative publicity generated is going to simply destroy their credibility in the eyes of the stock market and in the eyes of the people. We don't think we heard a response from their side of the house. They might try to do it in time, but it's a bit too late. No. Secondly, we say even if we concede that all these companies have cost-cutting, incentives, we tell you that that's what the IAEA is there for. That's why the IAEA goes in and regulates. They didn't regulate enough in Japan. Yes, that's why we stand for a model where the IAEA regulates far more. The next rebuttal New Zealand gave us on this point was this. It said, the IAEA is never going to be able to force countries to comply with it. Our first response was, hang on, isn't that just as bad in your case? Arguably, it's even worse. Because you want them to get rid of the nuclear reactors totally. All we want them to do is allow an inspector in once every few years to check your reactor and then comply with what he tells you. We don't think we've got a sufficient response from their side of the house. And you know what? We think that in the status quo, there is a huge incentive to comply with the IAEA. Governments around the world are looking at what has happened to the government of Japan and are telling themselves, we don't want this to happen again. Which governing body is the world's foremost expert at nuclear reactors? The IAEA. Countries around the world have a huge incentive to comply with the IAEA. Finally, their third speaker, they gave us this strange argument about how we are effectively saying that many countries around the world can never use nuclear energy. Our point is, yes, like if your country is earthquake prone all the time, then maybe you shouldn't use nuclear energy. In the same way that if you're a landlocked country, you probably shouldn't use tidal energy. But there are clear examples of countries who can and should make use of nuclear energy, like France and Germany do in the status quo. Continental Europe without disasters, with vast tracts of land to build buffer zones in that can make good use of the nuclear energy and are doing it in the status quo. Alright, first point of contention dealt with. Let's go on to my next point. Is alternative energy ready? We don't think it is. No thank you. The first reason why alternative energy isn't ready, and clearly someone up there agrees with me, the first reason why alternative energy isn't ready is because there's going to be a vast amount of time lag between the state the technology is in now and the state we need it to be in order to fund, the energy resources of the entire world. Just think of China. Is it really conceivable that they can put in place enough solar panels to, feed the doubling of energy that is going to be required over the next 20 decades? It requires solar panels the size of Texas just for the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. Imagine how many solar panels are going to be required in China. So no, alternative energy isn't ready. So what does that mean? That means Team New Zealand relies on conventional energy in the meantime. And it's here that we think nuclear energy is fantastic as a bridging technology between the time we need for alternative energy to get ready and the time where we would not use conventional forms of energy because it's vastly damaging to the environment and to human lives. We've said that from the very first speaker onwards, we don't think they've given us sufficient analysis on this point. No. Then New Zealand comes up and says, okay, we want you to talk about the very worst cases of nuclear energy, like Fukushima and Chernobyl, and we are going to tell you why that's far worse than alternative energy. First of all, we've already said we don't stand for these cases, just like New Zealand said they don't presumably stand for thousands and millions of coal miners dying in China. No, but if they really want to compare the worst case scenario, fine, let's do it. Let's compare all the deaths in Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island to the worst case scenario on that side of the house. All the deaths that have been caused by the coal mining in China, by oil explosions like Deepwater Horizon, by the abuse of oil resources in countries like Nigeria, we tell you the amount of life lost is clearly greater on that side of the house. Even if they want to talk about alternative energy, we've taken down literally every single example of alternative energy there is. My first speaker told you why wind energy would destroy the environment because of the migratory patterns of birds. He told you why tidal energy and hydroelectric dams would do the same thing. My second speaker furthered the analysis with geothermal energy, and all down the table we've told you that solar energy simply isn't feasible. New Zealand can't tell us we're only looking at the worst forms of alternative energy, because guys, these are all the forms of alternative energies we have in the status quo. We've shown you why all the forms of alternative energy are not ready, no thank you, cause more harm than nuclear energy. We think this point falls clearly to our side of the point. Then they gave this strange analysis which said that, okay, even if conventional energy causes far more harm than nuclear energy, no, we think that's a good thing because the miners who work in coal mines want to be there, but the people who live outside nuclear reactors don't. First of all, people don't tend to live just outside nuclear reactors. That's what buffer zones are for. If they do in the status quo, we ask them to move and set up proper buffer zones. Secondly, miners in China don't exactly have much of a choice when it comes to not whether they want to work in the coal mine. Lots of the people working in the sort of industries Team New Zealand talks about are forced there by social economic circumstance as well. We're both talking about people who have been forced to work in these industries, even if we consider to Team New Zealand's analysis, which let me make it clear, we fundamentally do not. Team New Zealand's final argument was this point about how every country has some sort of alternative energy it can use. That fails to counter the examples of countries we brought up that just don't have any forms of this analysis, like Singapore, which doesn't have the land space for solar panels because you need much more land space for solar panels than you need for a nuclear reactor, doesn't have big tides if you wait a while or high winds. And okay, I'll take your answer.
So if you're reducing your scope to places like Europe, because Europe is supposedly only the fourth place, then why has Germany decided to remove nuclear energy by 2020?
We think Germany is being paranoid, responding to the sort of images we saw in Japan. We don't think that's a rational decision on behalf of the German government, just like we don't think it's a rational decision of all governments to institute nuclear energy. That point is gone. Let's go to my final point of contention. Is nuclear energy best for the world? First of all, I'd like to address this new point which cropped up in their third speaker about terrorists attacking nuclear power plants. We haven't heard it in any of their other statements. But alright, let's deal with it right now. First of all, we tell you there has never been a single instance of a terrorist attack on a nuclear plant that is successful. Secondly, we tell you the great thing about radioactive waste is that it's radioactive. Terrorists tend to die of radiation poisoning if they go in and get it. And even if terrorists happen to get the extremely specialized equipment which they are going to need to carry the radioactive waste, then we tell you that's a great way of finding out where the terrorists are because so few companies around the world produce such equipment and they are regulated by, guess what, the IAEA. So if Al-Qaeda wants to order tons of hazmat suits, we say that's great, we'll know where you are. But most importantly, we don't think they've dealt enough with my second speaker's analysis that this changes the geopolitics of the world to a positive extent. Even if we concede that we'll become dependent on a few countries for uranium, and we don't, because my second speaker pointed out you can refine uranium from seawater, we tell you it's a lot better to be dependent on Australia and Canada than it is on Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's a really good thing. On their final point about moral persuasion, we tell you rogue states are rogue states for a reason. They don't tend to listen to moral persuasion. Iran doesn't go, everyone stops using nuclear energy, I guess I better stop too. That just doesn't exist in the status quo. So because nuclear energy is safe, alternative energy isn't ready, and nuclear energy is better for the world, go with Team Singapore.
Thank the third opposition speaker for his speech, and we now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. The opposition team will deliver their speech first. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal 1 once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timer will signal twice. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, I call upon Ashley Schumacher.
I'm going to look today at two different visions of a world. The kind of world that Team New Zealand wants to propagate, and the kind of world that Team Singapore stands and supports. Let's first look at the world of New Zealand. It is a very strange sort of world, because in this world they insist that it is not realistic for us not to build nuclear reactors on fault lines, that we need to build them on fault lines to have a reasonable debate, that we need to build them in city centers in order to have a reasonable debate. This is not what a world should be like. In any reasonable world, these are the measures that can and should be taken, and those are the measures of our policy. It is also the world where they try to pander to the paranoia of a few small groups in society. Because they try to talk about the harms, but these harms were vastly magnified in relation to what they actually were. What are the harms we talked about? They first said, well, let's look at natural disasters. Then we replied and said, actually, if you think about it, Fukushima falls on our side of the house, doesn't it? Because in the worst possible instance, where the worst kind of design, the worst kind of regulation, and the worst kind of natural disaster happened, it took vast harms in order to create that failure. And that wasn't even a policy we supported. We said if those harms only occur in such extreme circumstances, what about the circumstances which happened on our side of the house, in our policy? That is a world where we have a lot more safety, and it's unfair of them to push us to defend extreme things like wanting to build nuclear reactors on fault lines. In any case, we told you we can mitigate the impact of natural disasters all the time by building very safe and sound nuclear reactor designs. We gave you track records for where this has been done. Then we talked about long-lasting harms. We said, first of all, the examples where these harms accrue, like Chernobyl, aren't relevant in our case in the very first place. No reply. But then we gave you scientific analysis because, as I pointed out, I'm a bit of a geek. We said many of these substances which last for very long in the environment tend to have extremely low levels of radioactivity. Again, no response. But we also talked about how in our case, in their case, there's no energy independence, and that's a vast harm too. So their world is a world we just don't stand for. What then is the world of Singapore? The world of Singapore is a very reasonable sort of world, because we trust countries to listen to the IAEA when it tells them it's probably not very sensible to build a nuclear reactor on top of an earthquake fault line. They said, oh, this means you're never going to build them anywhere. That's clearly not the case. We talked about places like continental Europe, where it has been done successfully. We gave you examples of places in America where this has been done successfully. But what did we tell you? We said, even if the world of Singapore is a relatively small world, and we never conceded that, we tell you, it's a good thing that some countries have this resource, because that allows them to invest in a much more efficient and effective form of energy and lets us tide over to the period when we can use these other more efficient forms of energy. We also told you that ours is a world where we're realistic about the limitations that current forms of green energy have. And we literally went step by step and showed you why in every single kind of energy they wanted to talk about, there were massive harms as well. We talked about coal mining in a way that damaged entire communities with what built around these industries. We talked about the deep water horizon. That destroyed the community as well. We talked about the way geothermal energy poisons the water table. We talked about solar energy and wind energy and how they're incredibly inefficient. We talked about how the Three Gorges there cause a massive humanitarian crisis. If they wanted us to demonstrate harm, then demonstrate harm we did. But we also told you, in our world, we give countries energy security. We don't put them on a leash, because we don't force them to be dependent on countries which are often kleptocratic and corrupt, like Russia or like many of the states in the Middle East and in OPEC. That was analysis we never heard a proper response to. What is the world of Singapore? It is a reasonable world, it is a safe world, and it is a realistic world. We are very proud to stand, and we stand in opposition.
And to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Thomas Simpson.
Speaker, the world of Singapore, apart from sounding like the name of a theme park, was one that was not in the real world. Their world was one where all other energy sources are impractical. We don't think things like solar power, wind power, hydropower, things that are employed in most countries, are the hugely radical things they have been made out to be. I'm going to look at this debate in two issues. Firstly, is nuclear energy a viable and safe source for our energy needs? And secondly, how do the alternatives compare? So we came out very clearly at First Act and told you about the huge human costs of having people die indiscriminately in disasters, of having entire generations plagued with diseases, with cancers. This wasn't something that we were prepared to stand for. We showed you the huge environmental costs where waste is dumped in places like Somalia and ruin entire livelihoods and entire villages' ability to earn an income. So their only real response to this was, we can regulate. We think that the current system of regulation has failed. The International Atomic Energy Agency has shown consistently that it's been unable to mitigate all the risks that we showed you. Despite telling Japan to fix things up, nothing changed and Fukushima happened. We think this is an unacceptable risk. So realising that in fact this regulation doesn't work, we had the negative team then come out and say governments and companies don't want to ruin their reputation. We think that chancing lives, gambling with an enormous human cost on your company's reputation is an unacceptable risk and one that we are not prepared to take. So then they wanted to tell you about all these great things like buffer zones and how we can have more containment fields and so on. Essentially, they conceded that most countries shouldn't have nuclear energy. They essentially limited it to about probably 3 states that meet all of the conditions they set out. Effectively, they agree with us on most of these points. So then they told us this won't happen and it's impractical, states won't want to do this. We think they misunderstand the entire point of debate. So then they told us that it influences geopolitics because we're not reliant on oil. We think that only a few nations will be able to develop nuclear energy and maintain it in the way they want to. When only 3 states are able to have a functioning nuclear program, you're going to have to be reliant on them. This only creates more power imbalances as these nations have more power. We also told you about rogue states and the risk of terrorism. Now, the only real response to this was terrorists don't want to die. We think we should just refer to them to the case of September 11th. So then, the second issue I'm going to look at was how the alternatives compare. So we told you that there are plenty of alternatives, things that are actually employed in most countries around the world. Most countries don't rely on nuclear energy for their power source and seem to get on fire. So then they told you that, there's all these disasters with things like oil rigs blowing up and coal mines exploding. We showed you that even if, on a utilitarian basis, more lives might be saved, we think that the risks of nuclear energy are such that it impacts on people indiscriminately, people who don't choose to be there. Also, we think that it's a problem of magnitude where you have the risk of hundreds of thousands being subjected to cancer, subjected to diseases, having entire regions essentially wiped out and rendered uninhabitable. So then they wanted to tell us at third negative that this would only be a stopgap solution before we can develop alternatives. We think that they were effectively conceding that nuclear energy is not great by telling us that they wanted to move away from it. So then we showed you that we actually make it more effective and create a greater impetus for the development of alternative sources when we're not relying on this. We never had any real response to this. So because we live in the real world and we understand the huge risks that we're not prepared to tolerate, and we understand that alternatives are available, we are proud to propose.
Good morning, Nathan. I'm just going to time myself so I don't stand up here forever. Okay, firstly, I would really like to thank the Grove Academy for hosting us this morning, and the tea and the coffee upstairs. I really appreciate the facilities, and on our rating day deserve a round of applause, and all the room managers. So with the thanks out the way, let me get to what I'm sure you guys are waiting on candidates for. So I think in this debate, we really saw that this was 2 A bracket teams who were facing each other in an Octo final, and it really post-debate, and I must tell you straight up that we had a 3-2 split. So this debate was very close, and I was the adjudicator. That said, the split basically came down to how we were weighting the issues. And it's not that we didn't agree with how the debate unfolded, we agreed on that, it's just how each adjudicator weighted the issues involved. So, again, this debate was clear, but very, very, very strong debate. Anyway, so I'm not going to deal with the content style strategy feedback, because I'm sure you guys are tired of that, but I'm just going to quickly say the issues of the debate. So we saw from team proposition telling us, taking the line of harms, pushing the harms line, and running a sort of policy that will replace nuclear power plants with alternative energies. Opposition came up and said, well, we're going to firstly alter the policy of things slightly now so that harms are reduced, and secondly, we're going to try and also go alternative at the very end. We heard later on as their sort of thing better, we're going to go alternative also, but we need nuclear now. And so what we felt that there were problems with both sides' policy. We felt that side proposition, well, the majority felt, that as proposition laid out their policy idea, well, we need to replace nuclear energy with alternatives. If their harms were so extreme, they then had to prove that alternatives would be an immediate transition, and that we abandon nuclear now, something along those lines. And proposition, on the other hand, was making some sort of concession to the idea that harms are in fact a relevant problem if they were going along the lines of saying that we're going to alter how the structures work now. So we saw both sides. We thought there was a slight strategic issue there. But with that said, we thought that one side managed to take the issues and push forward their line throughout. And so it was mainly down to issues of consistency of line from the beginning, and the idea of replying of responses to that line and defending it. While some judges felt that one side was able to do that to the full extent and weighted that as the issues and the ones they want, the other judges felt the other side felt. So to give you the verdict, we awarded this debate